Doctors of Reddit, have you ever been there when someone has yelled, "Is anyone here a doctor?" I was with my father once. He is a doctor. When anyone who is a doctor was paged over a train speaker. 2 cars down, a woman was having a medical emergency. Someone then came to my seat and said my father needed my help. Turns out she only spoke Spanish and I was taking it in high school at the time. I doubt I knew any medical terminology, but mostly just comforted her. Dad determined her appendix was rupturing. They made an unscheduled stop and had an ambulance waiting. We got free meals in the dining car and polo shirts with the train's logo. I worked at a ski resort for a few years. Some interesting stuff happened. Guy drops over in the lift line. Massive heart attack. The 3 guys standing directly behind him. A doctor, heart surgeon, neurologist. They kept him alive long enough for the helicopter to land at the lift, and one of them flew to the hospital with him. Ski patrol said he lived. I was at a Walmart yesterday. On my way out to the car I can see people running toward the corner of a lot screaming, "Someone call 911. So I did. Smoke is rising and an engine roar is getting stronger. By the time I got there someone has pulled the keys out of the ignition but the lady was still slumped over to her right. Another big dude and I pulled her out of a car that was sitting on top of those yellow barriers just a few feet off the ground. She had complete cardiac arrest. Being a pediatric ICU nurse and transport resource for my hospital, the bare necessities for proper CPR are always in my car. I started the compression and that other dude ran to get the ambu bag. We reversed her by the time ambulance arrived. She managed to thank us before leaving on the ride. Yesterday was a good day. Thanks for saving a life. When I was like 10 or 12, my family and I were on a flight from Dominican Republic to New York City when a man had a heart attack. The flight attendants asked for a doctor, and my siblings and I told them my mom was a pediatrician. My mom was hesitant because of liability issues, but there weren't any other medical professionals stepping up to the plate. Turns out there wasn't much to do at that point but turn the plane around since we were 30 minutes into a 3-hour flight. The whole experience delayed the flight like 2 hours and we got a couple of dirty looks from other passengers. But at least that guy got medical attention and we got a free upgrade to first class. It was the first and only time I've ever flown first class. I enjoyed it. My father, who was on a flight, heard the cries for a doctor. He responded. The man was on his back under cardiac arrest. No pulse. My father performed CPR and the man vomited into my father's mouth. Apparently this happens a lot, and that was the last thing that man did before death. My father performed CPR for 30 minutes. Called up my dad for more details. The deceased man was a CIA agent. Found the badge when he was looking for a family member to call while waiting for the paramedics to pronounce him. Apparently he was on official business. Your dad is a hero, regardless if the man made it or not. My dad is an emergency room doctor and when we were flying to Spain, they asked for a doctor. Some dumb girl had decided to take ecstasy before getting on the plane and was freaking out having a psychotic episode. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and combined with the ecstasy and anxiety of flying she had broken down. My dad couldn't really do anything but sit up with her and talk her down all the way across the Atlantic. The airline was so thankful that our tickets were free and they gave us a free bottle of champagne. I'm a paramedic and was eating at a restaurant when one of the people at my table who could see around a corner told me to check this out. I turned the corner and there is a man who is alternating between clutching his throat and flailing wildly as he is weakly coughing. Meanwhile, the bartender is trying to perform the Heimlich on this guy's upper chest and lifting him completely off his feet, which was probably why the guy was flailing wildly as his eyes bulged out of his head like a cartoon character. As the choking victim was able to cough, I told the bartender to please deactivate crushinator mode and let him cough it up. Once the victim was able to get a good cough in, he spat his steak up and went back to his meal, though probably a bit sore. I earned the easiest free meal ever. TLDR. Stopped a bartender from incorrectly performing the Heimlich maneuver on someone who didn't need it and got a free meal. I'm sorry I laughed because of the casualness of "Hey, check out that guy choking to death." I was on a cross-country flight to the west coast when a girl on board started having convulsions. The flight attendants were all in a panic and they started pleading for a doctor. I am a radiology resident, so if this ever happens I cross my fingers and hope that someone else stands up. Unfortunately no one did, so I volunteered that I was a doctor. I walk up the aisle and ask the family her history, and it turns out she had a seizure disorder but hadn't taken her meds that morning. I have the flight attendants get me a working oxygen mask and then I ask the plane, does anyone here have any Valium or Ativan? Of course about 15 people raise their hands. I collect what I need, pop a handful to calm my nerves, and give her a 4mg of Ativan when she was interictal. Well, the last part is true. She didn't have another one the rest of the flight, which in all likelihood would have happened had I done nothing. Tried to convince the flight crew we didn't need to stop for an emergency landing less than 1 hour from our destination, but they didn't listen. TLDR. She must have had the fish. Pro tip. Most public places you'll find lots of people with benzos, which will do in a pinch to prevent status epilepticus. Nice pro tip. Guess I should fake seizures more often. I was on a plane from San Francisco to Seattle a couple of years ago when a girl collapsed in the aisle from exhaustion or some other sickness. The flight attendants got on the intercom and asked if there were any doctors on board. The lady next to me raised her hand. She was an emergency room nurse, and 2 other people stood up nearby, a cardiac surgeon and a pediatrician. That sick lady got better health care than people get on the ground. TLDR. 3 doctors on a plane. My story's anticlimactic, but it bears telling here. I was on a plane and they asked for a doctor over the PA. I was an EMT with a good amount of experience, so I rang my flight attendant call button to help. The stewardess comes over and I explain that I can assist. She says no, we're looking for a doctor. At that point I realize how little people know about the medical profession. Trust me, in an emergency situation, with limited resources, you would much rather have the ingenuity, improvisation and experience of an EMT over some random dermatologist who happens to be on the plane. I don't know what happened to the victim on the plane, but we didn't divert and there were no ambulances waiting for us when we landed, so it couldn't have been that bad after all. And I'm in med school now, so just a couple of years before laypeople think I'm useful. That's such a shame. I got mad respect for the EMTs of the world. That job would freak me out. Yep, my softball coach when I was in 4th grade had a seizure at practice and started throwing up bile. One of the parents ran up and yelled, "Is anyone here a doctor?" Another parent came running and yelling, "I'm a doctor, I'm a doctor." I just turned and ran home as fast as I could. On a transatlantic 747 flight with 350 ppl, 3 hours into the 12-hour flight, this person collapses right in front of me. There was like a 10-second pause with everyone watching to see if anyone would help. Bystander effect. A bunch of call attendant lights started dinging on around her. I got up and decided to help. To the lay public, due to the medmal situation in the US, a lot of physicians are very hesitant to commit themselves to a situation like this. I know there are good Samaritan laws, but who knows? In the back of my head I was like, don't be a stroke, pay, or heart attack, otherwise we're going to have to land this plane. Anyway, after a thorough exam, given the tools available, she was okay, had a vagal reaction and was fine for the rest of the flight. I was just so happy that I didn't have to force land the plane with that many people on board. Funny things, when asking for the med kit, the flight attendant gave me a stethoscope and BP cuff. When I asked whether this was all they had, they said yes, to all doctors. I later learned that an international 747 flight should have a full complement of ET tubes, ACLS meds, etc. My flight attendant was clueless. BP cuff they provide is an old school analog. Trying to listen to carrot cough sounds on a 747 is near impossible. There's a few pages of paperwork. No automatic upgrade to first class or certificates. I did get an extra drink. Had a vagal reaction. Until I looked that word up, I thought that story really took a left turn. I've responded to a half dozen or so such calls on flights. Nothing too dramatic except for the guy who was sitting right next to me who had a seizure. My worst was once when I was riding the train in California and got the call after the train suddenly stopped. You can imagine that there wasn't much I could do for the guy who had stepped in front of it. I was a waitress at a wedding reception when a woman had a heart attack. They requested if anyone was a doctor among the guests. There might have been one, but there were also a few nurses. Then they requested if anyone had any nitroglycerine spray, which luckily my mother, who was in attendance as a guest at the wedding, had some. TLDR. The wedding cake was delicious and they had a chocolate fountain. Your TLDR made me laugh out loud on my lunch break. Now a guy named Bill is staring at me. Frick you, Bill. Mind your own business. In a fancy restaurant in Seattle, when someone screams, "Someone help my father," a firefighter, former paramedic, runs over in his suit and tie, a la Tom Cruise across the top of the train in Mission Impossible, with me trailing close behind him. A 90-some-odd woman was face down in her plate of food, unconscious. Panic ensued among everyone but my dad. The manager kept telling my dad to back away. "I'm medically trained. We can't touch her." He ignored her, with a smile on his face, and simply laid her down on the ground and put her feet up on a chair. She came to in less than 20 seconds. When everyone else thought she was having a heart attack, he knew that she was just passed out from what I now know was some sort of syncopal episode. Paramedics came 5 minutes later, checked her out, and left her at the restaurant to finish her dinner. He got a Christmas card to his fire department a month later from the stranger's family thanking him for bringing skill and sense of calm. Couldn't be more proud to be his son. I was on a plane once from La to Philly. All the flight attendants were crowding around one row, and the people who were sitting there went to sit in the back. This commotion lasted quite a while until finally, over the loudspeaker, a flight attendant requested that all doctor and medical professionals on board press their call buttons. There were 7 or 8 dings, and the flight attendants went around speaking with the doctors and other professionals until finally picking somebody to go up to the row with them. He stayed there the whole flight, and when the flight landed 3 hours later, I guess they decided we did not have to land early. Everybody had to wait while a man from the row was taken off in a stretcher. Turns out he was having seizures. TLDR. Doctors helped during emergency on 5-6 hours flight. That is a very good way of getting the help, much better than dealing with terrash of docs. I always imagine that when a doctor is called on public transport, they sigh, unbuckle their seatbelt and say, "My time to shine." I was on a transatlantic flight a few years ago when the flight attendant announced we had a medical emergency and asked if there was a doctor or anyone with medical experience on the flight. Now, being a first-year medical student at the time, I thought I knew everything, so I sprung from my seat to help. And luckily there was an actual doctor that showed up, because as the woman was seizing I realized I didn't know a dang thing. I am not, but my dad is. We were at a summer resort on a family holiday when some boy fainted while swimming and started to float unconsciously, and he was picked by panicked vacationers. People started forming around the passed out kid, who may have inhaled quite a bit of water as he passed out. People start calling for a doctor, and my dad makes for this kid and telling people to clear out and let him through. At the same time, another doctor is doing the same thing from the opposite side of T-ring of people around the kid. As it turns out, the other doctor was a close friend of my dad's from med school who lost touch over the years, and they instantly recognize each other. So, my dad and his friend starts chatting instead of attending to that poor little bugger. After couple seconds of reminiscing, they start performing CPR and save the kid. I was 12 or 13 at the time, and it was weird and funny to see how your dad was the clumsy dad and hero at the same time. I am a vascular surgeon. For some reason this seems to happen with some regularity for me on international flights. The last time I was flying back from Japan, they asked for a doctor. There was this young Japanese dude who was pretty much comatose. I took his vitals. He was breathing. BP and pulse were normal. We found a bunch of pills in the back of the seat in front of us. They were Japanese meds, and so I did not recognize the name, and I presume they were likely sleeping pills, Benzos or some such. Anyhow, we kept an eye on him and he woke up eventually before we landed. Flight attendants pretended like nothing had happened. One time I was flying to Japan and I had some Japanese curry, which unbeknownst to me must have had walnuts or something. I am pretty severely allergic to any tree nuts and started to throw up. No breathing issues luckily, but I have had full-blown anaphylaxis once before. They asked for a doctor and some doc from Queens helped me out. He determined I just needed IM Benadryl and no epinephrine. Threw up pretty much the entire way to Japan though. What a miserable flight. There was a cute girl next to me I was hitting it off with too, and I went totally SAP after that. From these experiences I learned that the medicines and monitors they supply on a plane are extremely limited. It is a bit scary if something serious were to happen over the ocean on a long flight. Not a doctor. I broke my leg the summer before my senior year of high school. A pin was put in it and I recovered. The Halloween of my freshman year in college, I went to the university Halloween dance dressed as Socrates, toga and sandals. Crossing the dance floor to get some punch, I slipped on some water, felt my bad ankle twist, and heard a snap. I instantly started falling and grabbed out for anyone to hold me up. I was in the middle of a crowded dance floor and the person I grabbed was dressed as a doctor. "Help me get to a chair," I said. He sat me down and started examining my ankle. I say to him, "I think it's broken." He says to me, "I'm actually a doctor, and I'm sure it's broken. Let's get you an ambulance." He was a recently immigrated doctor from Asia who was at my college to get the credits required to apply for American med school. I had broken my leg and now have a plate and 7 screws holding it together. TLDR. There was a doctor in the house. By awesome chance. My mom's a doctor and stuff happens like this all the time. One time she was at the beach on the 4th of July watching the fireworks show and all of them went off on the ground and they went over the loudspeakers and asked if there were any doctors, so my mom ran about 1/4 of a mile to where they all went off with her doctor's bag. Turns out 10 doctors already beat her for a couple of cuts. This happened to my uncle. He is a cardiologist. He was on a flight when someone had a heart attack. There was the classic "is anyone here a doctor?" and my uncle came to the rescues. He resuscitated the passenger and went to the hospital with him after landing, instead of the golf course, so the hospital doctors would know exactly what the problem was. The airline thanked him a week later with 2 round-trip tickets anywhere in North America. Happened on a plane I was on once. Captain made an announcement for a doctor. Guy behind me was a doctor. It was the coolest thing ever, like straight out of a movie. Turns out the guy just had the poops. 1 up vote for poops. Not a doctor, but military police. At the installation I was stationed on, there was a huge baseball field right across from the main gate and the military police station. There was a 1-lane road that divided the MP station and the field. A bunch of us were out on a sunny afternoon playing softball after work. I was catcher. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a car step on the brakes pretty hard because they were about to rear-end another car that braked suddenly. That caused a bicycle rider, who admitted he was riding inattentively, to run into the car face first in their back window, shattering the glass, etc. I dropped my gear and took off running, along with a ton of other MPs. T-shirts were flying off guys' backs to help staunch the bicyclist's bleeding while I'm trying to pick the bigger pieces of glass out of his face so we can try to mitigate the bleeding there, too. It was just a short run up the driveway to the MP station, and within a minute, we had an ambulance and the guy packaged for transport. If he had to get injured that badly anywhere and on any day, he picked the right place and time. Just had a vision of 10 Matthew McConaughey's sighing at the opportunity to finally have a reason to remove their shirt. Not myself personally, but a guy I was once stationed with is a Navy corpsman. Fancy term for a medic. He was driving home, a motorcycle in front of him lost traction and wiped out. He pulled over and grabbed his medic bag, called 911 and had the guy more or less stable by the time the ambulance arrived. The guy survived and the corpsman received a medal for it. My father was on a flight with a friend. Both were medical directors flying to Chicago to look at new medical equipment for their companies. They page on the overhead if any doctors could come to the front of the plane. My dad's friend was in the aisle seat, so he went up there, and a man in first class was having a heart attack. The friend got him situated, and thankfully they were still on the tarmac, so they went back to the gate and got the man medical attention. My dad's friend then got a first class ride to Chicago, 1/2 HR flight from DFW. While my dad was stuck in the plane, he still gets made fun of for having to sit back there. I always get drunk on flights so that I don't have to give medical treatment. Many doctors do this. Plus, I'm a radiologist, so unless the patient needs an X-ray read, then I'm not going to be much use. A true hero of our time. My GF and I were in Kauai, and I must have eaten something I was allergic to. We were walking along on the grass in front of Duke's when I just passed out, dropped like a sack of potatoes. I'm told she ran into the restaurant and shouted, "Is there a doctor in the house?" Turns out there wasn't, but there was a nurse, who stayed with me till the ambulance got there, got hauled to hospital, pumped full of IV Benadryl, and sent back to my hotel in a few hours. Father-in-law is a surgeon. His advice is never answer the first 2 calls for a doctor. The reasoning is that there probably is another doctor on board and that it is not worth the risk of being sued. By the 3rd call it is either an actual emergency or you really are the only doctor. Not sure if it is morally right or wrong, but it is the sad state of affairs in the United States legal system. I'm fairly sure Good Samaritan laws protect against this, as long as you didn't do anything blatantly wrong, like circumcise someone who needs CPR. Make sure you are within the limits of the law in the area you are in. Side note, this applies to firearms too, people. Stay safe, stay illegal. My family was on vacation in Italy one summer, and while we were driving we saw a guy that fell off his moped. Nothing dramatic, he just slowly tipped his moped and fell off. Anyway, my dad, who's a doctor, saw this, rolled down his window and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Do you need a doctor?" The guy turned around, looking hella frightened, gave my dad a weird look and went off on his moped. We mocked our dad for that incident the whole summer. One summer, on a blisteringly hot day when I was 16, and dumb, I might add, I had raced 6 kilometers on my bike as hard as I could to the bank. I was of course wearing long black jeans and a black baggy t-shirt. Lo and behold, when I got in line, I passed out from a heat stroke. Luckily, the man in line behind me was a doctor and immediately ordered ice behind my neck and cold sugary water. I was out for about 30 seconds, but I would have had brain damage had the doc not been there. Needless to say, I'm now nuts about my health and would never do something so dumb again. Thanks, doc. You would be extremely unlikely to have suffered brain damage. Twice on planes, but apparently they wanted medical doctors to help people, not a scientist to solve equations and solder things. So, I was the guy who yelled out, "Is anyone here a doctor?" I was with my mom and kids at the Topsfield Fair, and she started feeling faint and sat down. She had a bit of water, but I could tell she wasn't recovering. We were actually sitting next to her kids sing along, so it was pretty noisy. She slouched off the picnic table and I caught her, and I actually remember being a little embarrassed to start yelling, but I did. There was a doctor and a nurse in the crowd who came to help, then the paramedics. Turned out to be heat stroke, and she was okay, but it was scary, and it definitely felt weird to be yelling that out in a crowd. When my wife graduated from medical school, a bunch of her fellow graduates, their families and us were flying from area that housed the university's hospital back to where the graduation was being held. There, in an airplane full of giddy soon-to-be conferred MDs, an attendant yelled out, "Is there a doctor on the plane?" Immediately, 10 previously strong and proud heads sunk into their seats as they all nervously looked back and forth at each other to see who would be the first to deal with a real-life emergency. Not having this, I pushed my wife out of her seat and towards the attendant. By the time she arrived, a motherfucking elderly dentist had hobbled to the rescue and was dealing with said man. The rest of that trip was remarkably quiet. My mom and I were on a flight from Rome, Italy to Atlanta, GA. About 6 hours in, a flight attendant got on the overhead speaker and asked if there were any doctors or nurses aboard the flight. My mother immediately stood up and walked to the other part of the cabin where I couldn't see. After about 20 minutes she sits back down and says nothing, like nothing happened. I asked her, "So what happened?" "Oh, lady was having a seizure. We just had to do blah blah blah." Medical terminology that I don't understand. All in all, it was something nice to break the boredom of a 12-hour flight. Thank you for clarifying where Rome is. I was totally lost. Getting really sick on a flight is extra freaking scary. No, I am not a doctor. Herp derp it. I am not a doctor, but my dad has been the person yelling, "Is anyone here a doctor?" The community had some parade going on. My dad was in a crowd standing on the curbs like an upstanding citizen. A little girl started choking on something. Her father frantically attempted some of the worst CPR my dad has witnessed. My dad calmly walked over and asked what was wrong. The father freaked out, explaining the situation. My dad looked around real quick, Saw an ambulance and went out. Hi doc, we got a choking girl here. Paramedic comes over. CPR. She's fine. TD. LR, my dad's level-headedness saved a little girl's life. My dad was at the opera when a lady in the audience suddenly fainted. My dad just carried her outside and let the staff take care of it. When he got back inside, a lady asked him did she die, and my dad replied that she did not. The lady then says it would have been a wonderful way to go, though. They were watching Wagner. Was on an airplane once in uniform. I'm in the army coming back from a conference. Flight attendant rang overhead and asked if there was a physician on board, and if so, please hit your call button. I hit the button. Total knockout of a flight attendant said that a few rows back, there was a guy that passed out into the aisle, and asked if I would mind having a look at him. I stood up, made it back a few rows to find this 300-pounder in the aisle, really groggy, not feeling so hot, horrible hangover, treated with a medication he wouldn't disclose, but he was otherwise fine. So, I'm at this guy's feet in my Accus, wearing major rank, and there's a guy at his head in the aisle looking at me. Apparently he was a healthcare provider as well and answered the call for help, too. He looked up at me, sneered, and said, "What, are you a medic? I've got this." I kind of laughed a bit and said no, but I'd like to help out anyway. I checked groggy guy's pulses, pupils, listened to his heart. He was fine. Got him back into his seat. Flight attendant was a bit miffed at the other physician's demeanor with the whole medic thing. She made it her mission to tell the guy the truth, that I was an orthopedic surgeon. She later found out that he was a dropout from EMT basic. Landed in Denver about 45 minutes later, and as I was walking past Starbucks, a lady screamed for a doctor. Her mom was having a seizure, known history of epilepsy, poorly medicated. I rolled her up on her side, put her head in my lap and had the daughter call 911. Daughter looked at me and said, "What are you, a medic? I need a doctor. I'm considering a forehead tattoo." Not a doctor, but had to call for one. I was flying to Europe with my friend one summer when she had horrible pains in her lower abdomen. I got the flight attendant, who then went over the intercom to ask for a doctor. Luckily, there was one in first class. He determined that she had kidney stones, and the plane was landed early. My dad ended up treating a woman who collapsed from heat stroke during a visit from George W. Bush. After the ordeal, they shook hands. At my first major academic conference, I was attending the first panel of the morning. The fourth paper in, the speaker stopped talking. What we thought was a dramatic pause in a paper on a gothic novel turned into a full-blown seizure. The woman next to him caught him as he fell over. None of us had cell phone reception in the bowels of the conference hotel, but someone managed to get the house phone to work and we called paramedics. Room full of doctors, not one of us the useful kind. You have been visited by the healthy spirit of exercise. Boy, you will burn all calories today. If you comment "blessed be the health hound," like and subscribe, you magnificent person.